Police believe that this was some sort of personal dispute. In this shooting, one student is dead, another critically injured. The student who survived this shooting is currently in the hospital, said to be in stable condition. As for the suspect, he is not a student, according to authorities. Authorities arresting Jacob Lee Bard of Evansville, Indiana, charging him with murder and first-degree assault. This all happened Tuesday afternoon on campus near a dorm. All classes have been canceled for the rest of the week as the investigation is still ongoing. But again, police say there is no...
You just watched the precise moment when the horror of fetal personhood ideology collides with the brutal reality of a human corpse being transformed into what can only be described as a state-mandated biological incubator. And we need to understand right now that this case of Adriana Smith is not some aberration or medical edge case, but rather the logical, grotesque fulfillment of laws written by men who genuinely believe that a collection of embryonic cells with detectable electrical activity has more legal standing and more constitutional protection, and frankly more humanity than a 30-year-old black nurse and mother who walked into a hospital with blood clots ravaging her brain, only to have doctors tell her devastated family that Georgia's heartbeat law means she is no longer the patient. Adriana Smith, a 30-year-old mother and registered nurse, was declared brain dead in February after blood clots were discovered in her brain, and doctors told her family that under Georgia's heartbeat law, they are legally required to maintain life support until the fetus reaches viability, which means we are witnessing in real time the state of Georgia asserting ownership over a dead woman's body for months on end, because somewhere deep in the legislative machinery of this country, there exists the pathological conviction that personhood begins at a heartbeat, but apparently ends when you become pregnant. The horror you just witnessed goes so far beyond the usual discourse about reproductive rights, because what we're actually seeing here is the complete and total erasure of black maternal autonomy through the combined force of fetal personhood laws and medical racism. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic, then consider that Monica Simpson of Sister Song said the family deserved decision-making power about medical decisions, but instead endured over 90 days of re-traumatization, expensive medical costs, and the cruelty of being unable to resolve and move toward healing, which is the polite nonprofit way of saying that this family has been forced to watch their daughter's body artificially sustained as a vessel, while the state prioritizes the potential life inside her over her actual death. The breathtaking cruelty here demands that we understand the through line connecting chattel slavery to contemporary fetal personhood ideology, because the roots of fetal personhood stretch back to the era of chattel slavery, when black women's bodies were treated as property, and their pregnancies subject to economic control, illustrated by slaveholders forcing women to lie on the ground with a hole dug out to supposedly shield the fetus, while the woman was whipped. In this historical continuity should make every single person watching this understand that we are not dealing with some neutral medical ethics question, but rather the modern manifestation of a system that has always viewed black women's bodies as state property to be controlled and exploited and used. Smith's case has become a symbol of the medical and ethical issues stemming from a Georgia law that bans most abortions and confers fetal personhood rights. And here's where we need to get absolutely crystal clear about what personhood laws actually do, because personhood measures effectively replace the rights of a pregnant person with the rights of the zygote, embryo, or fetus, limiting essential health care and making their care subordinate, which means that the moment Georgia's Living Infants Fairness and Equality Act determined that a fetus with a heartbeat qualifies as a legal person with constitutional rights, every pregnant person in that state became a second-class citizen, whose bodily autonomy could be overridden by the state's interest in protecting what they have decided to call an unborn child. This is not abstract legal theory. This is Adriana Smith's body kept functioning by machines while her mother said, "I'm not saying that we would have chose to terminate her pregnancy, but what I'm saying is we should have had a choice. And the deliberate removal of that choice represents nothing less than the state asserting reproductive surveillance and control over people capable of pregnancy in ways that should terrify anyone who claims to care about freedom or liberty or human dignity." Now here comes the bombshell that should make your blood absolutely boil, because the Georgia Attorney General's office released a statement clarifying that the state's heartbeat law does not require medical professionals to keep a woman on life support after brain death, stating, "There is nothing in the Life Act that requires medical professionals to keep a woman on life support after brain death," which means that the hospital's decision to tell this grieving family that the law mandated this nightmare was either a catastrophic misinterpretation or a deliberate choice to prioritize fetal life over every other consideration, including the explicit wishes of the deceased's family. Republican State Senator Ed Setzler, who authored the Life Act, disagrees with the Attorney General, telling the Associated Press he thinks the hospital acted appropriately, and that it is completely appropriate that the hospital do what they can to save the life of the child. Do you see what's happening here? Even the people who wrote this law cannot agree on what it means or requires, creating exactly the kind of legal ambiguity that results in doctors making the most conservative possible interpretation out of fear of criminal prosecution, while families are traumatized and women die, and the entire apparatus of reproductive health care becomes subordinated to the political project of establishing fetal personhood at any cost. The medical details matter immensely because we need to understand exactly how unprecedented and how medically questionable this entire situation is. A 2021 review found only 35 cases in medical literature where doctors declared a woman brain dead and aimed to prolong her pregnancy, with 27 resulting in a live birth. But here's the part that should make you stop and think about the desperation and the hubris involved in this case. Adriana Smith was 9 weeks pregnant when she was declared brain dead, and doctors are supposedly waiting until the fetus is at 32 weeks gestation, which is months from now, which means they are attempting to sustain a pregnancy in a corpse for over 5 months in an almost 9-week fetus, when the medical literature barely contains examples of this being attempted after the first trimester. The sheer experimental nature of what's being done to this woman's body without her consent and against her family's wishes represents a form of medical violation that we would immediately recognize as barbaric if it were happening in any other context, but because it's wrapped in the language of protecting innocent life and saving babies, we're supposed to accept that the state can commandeer a dead black woman's body for a medical experiment with uncertain outcomes, while her family pays mounting hospital bills and suffers ongoing trauma. Let me take you deeper into the contemporary landscape of abortion restrictions, because what happened to Adriana Smith is happening against a backdrop of escalating attacks on reproductive freedom that should terrify anyone paying attention. 13 states have enacted total bans of all abortion procedures, while an additional 28 states have passed bans with strict gestational age limits. An estimates project that a total abortion ban in the United States would increase pregnancy-related deaths from 675 to 724 annually, with an additional 49 deaths, which means we can quantify with horrifying precision exactly how many people will die as a direct result of these ideological crusades disguised as pro-life legislation. The data gets even more damning when you zoom in on specific states because maternal mortality rose 56% in Texas in the first full year of the state's abortion ban, up 95% among white women, and women who lived in states that ban abortion were significantly more likely to die during pregnancy, with a mother's risk of dying nearly twice as high in banned states. And if you think this is coincidence or correlation rather than causation, then consider that maternal mortality went down 21% in states where abortion is legal and accessible post-Dobbs, which provides exactly the kind of natural experiment that demonstrates unequivocally that these laws kill women. The racial disparities here are so extreme that they should be generating national emergency declarations and federal interventions, because black mothers living in banned states were more than 3 times as likely to die as white mothers in those states, representing 234% higher maternal mortality, and this gap widened significantly post-bans from 2.2 times to 3.3 times, which means that abortion bans are functioning as instruments of racial violence that target black women with lethal precision, while politicians who champion these laws perform concern about protecting life and promoting family values. Black infants died at a rate 11% higher than expected in states with abortion bans, with larger increases in infant mortality in southern states both overall and among black infants. Researchers estimate 22,180 more live births and 478 more infant deaths than expected across 14 states that banned abortion, which means we're not even talking about a trade-off where bans save fetal life at the expense of maternal life, but rather a system that produces more death across the board, more maternal death, more infant death, more suffering, more trauma, more families destroyed by laws passed by legislators who claim to value life above all else. The class dimensions of this cannot be ignored because among the 14 states with abortion bans, researchers found higher than expected live births among racially minoritized individuals, those without a college degree, Medicaid beneficiaries, unmarried individuals, younger individuals, and those living in southern states, which tells you with absolute precision who these laws are actually targeting and who bears the burden of forced pregnancy in America. And it's not the wealthy white women who can afford to travel to Illinois or California for abortion care, but rather poor women, black women, Latino women, young women, women who depend on Medicaid, women who live in the states with the worst maternal health outcomes and the fewest resources to support pregnant people and new parents. This is social engineering disguised as moral legislation, This is the state deciding that certain populations should be compelled to reproduce regardless of their circumstances or desires, while other populations retain full reproductive autonomy through the simple mechanism of economic privilege. And if you want to understand how abortion restrictions function as tools of oppression, then you need to understand that the logic of fetal personhood has been used for decades in policies and enforcement against women, particularly low-income women of color, with 413 cases from 1973 to 2005 of women arrested or deprived of physical liberty for allegedly hurting their fetus, and roughly 1,331 examples from 2006 to 2020, which demonstrates that fetal personhood doesn't just restrict abortion, but creates an entire architecture of surveillance and criminalization and punishment targeting pregnant people whose conduct the state deems insufficiently protective of fetal life. The healthcare implications spiral outward in ways that should alarm every physician and every patient, because in states with abortion bans, pregnant women have bled to death, succumbed to fatal infections, and wound up in morgues with what medical examiners recorded were products of conception still in their bodies. But panels in states with strict bans have done little to uncover whether the laws are contributing to maternal deaths. And Texas saw a 50% jump in the sepsis rate among women who lost their pregnancies in the second trimester, which means we're seeing preventable deaths from treatable conditions, because doctors are terrified to provide standard emergency care when that care involves removing fetal tissue or terminating a pregnancy even when the pregnancy is already failing and the patient is actively dying. Dr. Katrina Cameport noted that Dobbs has complicated clinicians' ability to offer patients the standard of care, with interviews revealing 3 categories of cases where abortion bans prevented standard of care, including patients with pre-existing conditions exacerbated by pregnancy. When you combine this with the reality that gaps in maternity care are widening post-Dobbs as clinicians leave states where they may face legal challenges and fewer medical residents choose to train in abortion ban states, you start to see how these laws create a death spiral where abortion restrictions drive away skilled providers, which worsens maternal health outcomes, which makes it even harder to recruit and retain obstetricians, which further degrades care in a vicious cycle that will take decades to reverse. Let's zoom out to the ideological architecture that makes all of this possible, because fetal personhood is not just a legal strategy, but rather a comprehensive worldview that seeks to fundamentally reorder American society around the principle that embryonic and fetal life possesses full constitutional rights from the moment of fertilization, and the legal doctrine of fetal personhood recognizes embryos and fetuses as legal persons with constitutional rights, and such laws police pregnant women and threaten access to all aspects of reproductive health care. The implications cascade outward in terrifying ways, because in the 2024 Alabama Supreme Court case, the state court found that fertilized embryos prepared for IVF were persons even before implantation, meaning any embryos that did not survive would violate the wrongful death of a minor act, before the legislature quickly passed legislation to allow doctors to continue providing IVF, which demonstrates how personhood ideology threatens not just abortion, but also fertility treatment and contraception, and basically any reproductive technology that involves the creation or destruction of fertilized eggs. Personhood measures threaten embryonic stem cell research, infertility treatments such as IVF, and treatments for cancer and other conditions, and even access to emergency contraception and other contraceptive methods can be denied, which means we're talking about a legal framework that would give a frozen embryo in a clinic the same constitutional protections as a living, breathing child, while pregnant people lose the right to refuse medical treatment or make decisions about their own bodies or even die with dignity when their organs are failing. The connections to Project 2025 and the broader conservative legal movement need to be made explicit because the extensive mandate calls to gut reproductive freedom, including effectively banning medication abortion, ending access to emergency abortion care, attacking contraception, deploying fetal personhood, and undermining IVF in federal policy. And as of November 2025, 48% of all Project 2025 policies have been enacted or are in progress, with nearly 40% of reproductive restrictions completed or underway, which means that what we're seeing with Adriana Smith in Georgia is just the beginning of a nationwide campaign to establish fetal personhood and eliminate reproductive autonomy through every available mechanism of state and federal power. Project 2025 proposes radical anti-abortion policies that would criminalize medication abortion, increase denials of abortion care, and expand surveillance and criminalization of pregnant people. Project 2025 urges the DOJ to criminalize mailing of medication abortion pills via enforcement of the Comstock Act, written in 1873, and if Comstock were enforced, it could ultimately ban mailing of anything used for abortion, including speculums, anesthetics, and pain medications sent through the mail, which would function as a de facto nationwide abortion ban imposed without a single vote in Congress. The enforcement mechanisms being developed should terrify anyone who values privacy or civil liberties, because personhood laws are applied to criminalize pregnant people, particularly Black, Latino, and Indigenous women, trans and non-binary people, due to systemic racism, and between 2006 and the end of Roe, nearly 1,400 pregnant people were arrested for allegedly endangering unborn life, and Project 2025's proposal to track pregnancy outcomes across the country means personal medical data could be extremely dangerous in the hands of an anti-abortion administration, especially for Black women, people of color, and immigrant communities already at greater risk of criminalization for reproductive health choices, which describes nothing less than a surveillance state apparatus designed to monitor pregnancies and prosecute pregnancy outcomes in ways that would make authoritarian regimes envious. When you live in a society where miscarriage can result in investigation, where stillbirth can lead to prosecution, where seeking abortion care can mean criminal liability, then pregnancy itself becomes a state of permanent surveillance and potential criminalization for anyone capable of becoming pregnant. And this is the future that fetal personhood advocates are building brick by brick through state legislatures and federal policy. The medical ethics violation at the heart of Adriana Smith's case needs to be centered, because what Georgia's law has effectively done is eliminate the concept of brain death for pregnant people, creating a bizarre legal category where you can be simultaneously legally dead according to every accepted medical standard, and also legally alive, because the state has decided that your pregnant status overrides your death and transforms your corpse into a vessel that must be maintained until the fetus reaches viability. Advanced directives that detail end-of-life treatment can be invalidated by state laws if you are pregnant, and these pregnancy exclusions can result in pregnant people receiving treatment they don't want or need, which means that even if Adriana Smith had written explicit instructions about not wanting prolonged life support or artificial maintenance of bodily functions after brain death, those wishes could be legally overridden the moment she became pregnant, because Georgia's personhood law has determined that fetal life takes precedence over her autonomy, even in death. The philosophical obscenity here is that we have constructed a legal framework where a person can lose their personhood by becoming pregnant, where the detection of fetal cardiac activity strips you of the right to control what happens to your own body, or even your own corpse, where the state claims the authority to commandeer your organs and your womb for months on end, because you have been reimagined not as a human being with rights and dignity, but as an ambulatory incubator, whose only legally relevant function is carrying a pregnancy to term. The partisan nature of this horror needs to be made absolutely explicit, because Georgia's Living Infants Fairness and Equality Act, also known as the Heartbeat Bill, was passed by state lawmakers mostly on party lines in 2019 and signed by Governor Brian Kemp, officially going into effect in July 2022 when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And every single one of these laws represents a deliberate choice by Republican legislators to prioritize fetal life over the lives and autonomy of pregnant people, while Democrats and reproductive rights advocates warned with agonizing prescience about exactly these kinds of scenarios. Georgia Democrats are calling for clarity in the abortion law, as Adriana Smith's case continues to grab headlines worldwide, though Georgia's top lawyer disagrees with the interpretation that the law mandated keeping Smith on life support. But this disagreement about statutory interpretation is precisely what makes these laws so dangerous, because doctors making real-time decisions about critically ill patients cannot wait for legal clarification or attorney general opinions, so they make the most conservative possible interpretation that prioritizes fetal life, because the alternative is potential criminal prosecution, loss of medical license, and public vilification. The Adriana Smith case also forces us to reckon with the profound medical racism embedded in how these laws are applied and interpreted, because this is a Black woman whose family was told they had no choice, whose body was transformed into state property, who has been maintained on machines for months while her mother watches her daughter breathe via ventilator and says she's not there, and we need to ask ourselves whether this same treatment would have been imposed on a wealthy white woman from an affluent Atlanta suburb, or whether her family would have been offered more options or different legal interpretations, or simply more respect for their wishes and their daughter's dignity. A 30-year-old Black woman in Georgia has been kept on life support for 3 months against her family's wishes because of the state's fetal heartbeat anti-abortion law, declared legally dead in February after a medical emergency. Monica Simpson of Sister Song emphasized that Black women must be trusted when it comes to healthcare decisions, that safety and lives are sacrificed when essential care is out of reach or criminalized, and that after devastating preventable deaths of multiple Black women, our lives are on the line, and human right to bodily autonomy has been violated, which situates Adriana Smith's case within the much broader history of medical experimentation on Black women, forced reproduction during slavery, contemporary maternal mortality disparities, and the ongoing refusal of American institutions to treat Black women's bodies as deserving of autonomy and protection and care. We need to connect this to the broader context of how abortion bans are killing women right now in 2025, because the horror of Adriana Smith's case is not that it's exceptional, but that it's emblematic of a healthcare system that has been deliberately broken by anti-abortion legislation. The stories of Amber Thurman, Jocelyn Barnica, Neve Crane, Candy Miller, and others illustrate harms as these women died due to being unable to access timely medical care in their states, which means we now have a growing list of names of women who would be alive today, if not for abortion bans. Women who died from sepsis or bleeding or infection because doctors delayed care or refused care, or simply couldn't provide care under the vague and threatening language of medical emergency exceptions. The legal ambiguity is not a bug but a feature because many bans have vaguely worded exemptions for risks to maternal health, serious fetal anomalies and pregnancies from rape or incest, and confusion about laws and ambiguity of legislative language leaves providers uncertain about the type and timing of medical care they can lawfully provide, affecting treatment of ectopic pregnancies, care for rupture of membranes before viability, or care for incomplete spontaneous abortions, which creates exactly the kind of chilling effect where doctors watch patients deteriorate while consulting lawyers instead of immediately providing life-saving treatment. The failure of oversight and accountability mechanisms tells you everything you need to know about whether the architects of these laws actually care about maternal health or protecting life, because panels in states that impose strict abortion bans have done little to uncover whether the laws are contributing to maternal deaths, and in a few states, political leaders who backed the bans have stood in the way of measuring their consequences by dismissing committees and slowing down their work, when most states with the most restrictive abortion laws have not finished reviewing deaths from 2022, the year most bans became effective after the Supreme Court overturned constitutional right to abortion, which means the states that passed these laws are actively avoiding investigating whether they're killing women because they know damn well what the data will show, and they cannot afford to have their pro-life rhetoric confronted with the reality of dead mothers and grieving families and preventable deaths caused directly by their ideological crusade. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that the conservative legal movement has successfully normalized the previously fringe concept of fetal personhood through incremental legislative victories and judicial appointments, and the fetal personhood movement has gained traction in multiple states since Dobbs overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022, and currently 17 states have established fetal rights by law or judicial decision to apply to criminal law or both criminal and civil laws, which means we're watching the real-time construction of a parallel legal system where fetuses have rights that can be asserted against pregnant people, where the state claims the authority to intervene in pregnancy on behalf of fetal interests, where every miscarriage becomes a potential crime scene, and every stillbirth triggers investigation, and every abortion attempt can result in prosecution. The endgame here is the complete elimination of reproductive autonomy through the mechanism of granting constitutional rights to embryos and fetuses, and once that principle is established, then everything else follows logically. Abortion becomes murder, IVF becomes manslaughter, certain forms of contraception become illegal, pregnancy becomes a state of compulsory bodily servitude to another legal person who happens to reside inside you. This is the future we're being promised by the architects of fetal personhood, and Adriana Smith's case gives us a glimpse of what that future looks like in practice. It looks like families destroyed by bureaucratic cruelty masquerading as medical necessity. It looks like Black women's bodies transformed into state property without their consent or their family's consent. It looks like months of expensive hospitalization while a corpse is maintained as a pregnancy incubator. It looks like doctors making decisions based on legal liability rather than medical ethics or patient wishes. It looks like the complete subordination of maternal personhood to fetal personhood in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, but which now represent the standard application of heartbeat laws in states controlled by anti-abortion legislators. The fact that even the Georgia Attorney General had to clarify that the law doesn't actually require this tells you how profoundly these statutes have warped medical practice and legal interpretation, creating an environment where the most extreme anti-abortion position becomes the default, because everyone is terrified of being the test case that results in prosecution. What we need to understand with absolute clarity is that there is no version of fetal personhood that doesn't result in the scenarios we're witnessing right now, No way to grant constitutional rights to embryos and fetuses without necessarily diminishing the rights of pregnant people. No mechanism for treating a fetus as a legal person, with interests that can conflict with the pregnant person, without creating exactly this kind of hierarchical relationship where one person's rights must give way to another's. Anti-abortion activists ignore the consequences of granting fertilized eggs constitutional rights, but a full range of radical implications exist, and fetal personhood changes the legal rights and status of pregnant people and forces them to forfeit their own personhood, which is not some abstract philosophical point, but the lived reality of Adriana Smith's mother watching her daughter's corpse kept functioning by machines because Georgia decided that a 9-week fetus with a heartbeat has more legal standing than a brain-dead woman whose family wants to let her die with dignity. The path forward requires understanding that this is not primarily a medical issue or an ethics issue, but a political issue that demands political solutions, which means electing legislators who will repeal heartbeat laws and personhood laws, confirming judges who understand that pregnant people are full human beings with constitutional rights that cannot be subordinated to fetal interests, passing federal legislation that protects abortion access and prevents states from criminalizing pregnancy outcomes, funding maternal health care, and particularly reproductive health care for low-income people and people of color who bear the brunt of these restrictions. States will continue to introduce legislation to expand or restrict reproductive health care as sessions begin, and in anticipation of Trump's return to the White House, states with reproductive rights protections have introduced bills to shield patients and doctors, while states with strict bans have started floating fetal personhood bans, abortion pill punishments, and other restrictions, which means the fight is happening right now in state legislatures across the country, and the outcome of these legislative battles will determine whether more families endure what the Smiths are enduring, or whether we begin to roll back the architecture of fetal personhood that makes these nightmares possible. This moment demands that we channel our horror and our rage into sustained political action, because Adriana Smith's case reveals the stakes with perfect clarity. Either we live in a society where pregnant people retain full personhood and constitutional rights and bodily autonomy, or we live in a society where pregnancy transforms you into a subordinate legal category, subject to state control and medical intervention and compulsory bodily servitude. There is no middle ground, no compromise position, no way to grant personhood to fetuses without taking it away from pregnant people, and every single person who claims to care about freedom or equality or human rights needs to understand that the fight against fetal personhood is the defining civil rights struggle of this generation. What happened to Adriana Smith is not an accident or a misunderstanding, but the deliberate policy choice of legislators who believe that fetal life matters more than maternal life, and until we remove those legislators from power and repeal their laws and rebuild a healthcare system that centers pregnant people's autonomy and dignity, we will continue to see Black women's bodies treated as state property and families destroyed by the grotesque logic of laws that value the unborn over the living.